Unfortunately, there is a lot of really terrible advice floating around out there on how to start and how to grow a podcast. Some of it is totally unfounded. Other advice is totally outdated, and most of it isn't actually helping you make forward progress as a podcaster or as a business owner who podcasts. So in this episode, we're going to talk about 3 of the biggest pieces of podcasting quote-unquote advice that's not actually helping you, and what to look for instead if you want to grow a top podcast that converts. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. So for those of you that are not familiar with the history of podcasting, here is the nutshell crash course. Podcasting has been around since I was a freshman in high school, 2003 to be specific, when the first RSS feed was created. Since then, it is safe to say we have seen a ton of change in the industry. And so there's lots of information out there that's circulating that at one point was valid, but now it's misinformation because it either no longer applies or it's simply out of date. But you know what they say about old dogs and new tricks. So what we have right now is this new wave of podcast experts who are preaching the same old, worn out, outdated information that on its own isn't actually helping you grow your podcast. I mean, how many times have you heard that consistency is the key to success? And you're like, I'm the most consistent person I know. I have never missed a week of publishing an episode, and I'm doing all of these other things that I've been told to do to grow the show, and my show is not growing like I expect it to. Or how many times have you heard, well, if you build it, they will come. Just get it started. Start the show. Don't quit. Just keep putting out good content and just trust that in time it's going to grow. How's that going for you right now? Has it actually helped? Or how many times have you heard, well, you need to grow your audience because more downloads equal more money. You can't make money from a podcast if you don't have a big audience. So, because you've been told by these experts, who you have no reason not to believe, that consistency is important and that content is king and that more downloads equals more in your bank account, you do the things that they tell you to do, like publish episodes every week and share your episodes to social media and email your list every time a new episode drops and give your best content away for free inside your episodes. And then do whatever you can to grow your audience. Go guest on other podcasts. Maybe you've tried starting or considered starting a YouTube channel because video podcasting is now the buzz. And you want to reach new people. You want to grow your show. You want to create an impact. You want your message heard around the world. And you've been told that podcasting is a long game, so don't expect results overnight. So you're committed. But still, your show is not growing as fast as you want it to. And if you haven't launched your podcast yet, you might be listening right now and you're like, this is my worst nightmare. Like, I don't want to waste my time creating a show that nobody listens to. And so my hope is that you take away just as much, if not more, from this episode if you were thinking of starting a podcast so that you can get your podcast started on the right foot. And look, I get it. I have followed all of this advice through the years, and I lived this way for too long, thinking that consistency was the key to success, and that I couldn't monetize until I had a big audience, and that giving away my best content for free inside of my episodes was the best way to convert my listeners to clients. But what I didn't realize was that I was being totally misguided by these common industry norms, these common beliefs in the industry. So it took me a lot longer to grow to the place that I am now than it would have had I realized this sooner. So whenever someone comes to us for help to launch their podcast, or particularly to grow their podcast, there are 5 signs that we look for that tell us that your content is blending in. If you have an existing podcast, then some of the signs are that you've gotten no new reviews in the last 14 days. You haven't ranked on Apple or Spotify in the last 30 days. You're putting calls to action in your episode, but they're not converting listeners to leads. Listeners might tell you that they love your show, but they're not asking, how do I work with you? What's the next step? And you're getting less than 500 downloads per episode, and or you haven't seen a significant increase in downloads in the last 3 months. And if you haven't started your podcast yet, you've probably toyed with the idea for the last 6 months or more. And right now you're probably looking at podcasting as a potential solution for your marketing because you're burnt out from having to post 3 to 4 or 5 times a week on Instagram or on LinkedIn, constantly coming up with content ideas that position your expertise, but that ultimately drive 0 sales because your content just gets buried in the news feed in less than 24 hours. And maybe your podcast is like that recurring dream that won't leave you alone. It's like that idea that keeps coming back around every couple of months, but you haven't started it yet because you're afraid of exactly what we're talking about here today. What if I start this thing and it doesn't take off? What if I start this thing and it fails? In fact, most podcasts now, they quit after episode 6. not because of a lack of information, but because of a lack of relevant information. You can Google or YouTube how to create a podcast and get thousands of hits in a split second. But the information that you get isn't actually the information that you need to grow a top podcast that stands out from your competition and that sends new leads to your business every day. So the information that is out there isn't actually helpful. The good news is I've got the info that you need. This show is not called Insider Secrets to a Top 100 Podcast for nothing. So let's break down each of these common industry norms, these beliefs, and talk through first why they aren't helpful, and then learn what you need instead to actually make it as a podcast host and to actually make your podcast a powerful marketing tool within your business. So let's tackle this first very common industry norm. Consistency is the key to success in podcasting. I can't tell you how many times that Instagram serves up some kind of podcasting post to me because it knows that I'm interested in podcasting. And this is supposedly the hook. Consistency. This is what you need to succeed in podcasting. I'm sorry, but if consistency were what you needed to succeed in podcasting, then wouldn't that mean that everyone who has released an episode every week without fail for at least a year or more and who gives away their best stuff inside every single episode, wouldn't they be in the top 100? I mean, we both know that's not the case. Here's what consistency actually is. It is not the key to success. It is a cog in the greater wheel of your overall podcasting strategy. What consistency does is it builds trust, which is important because you need that. Trust is a prerequisite for any sale. And take note of what I'm saying here because this is going to play a big role in myth number 3 that we're about to debunk about your audience size as it relates to income. But more importantly, this is what I want you to take away about consistency. Consistency creates a listener habit. This is key, and here is why. Think of products that you use every day out of habit. Simple things like the brand of coffee that you always buy. Or for me, the snacks that we have in the house because it's what I'm in the habit of putting in my cart on Instacart and having delivered to the house because I don't have time to go to the grocery. Or the Haya vitamins that I order for my kid and the MitoLife and Metagenic supplements that I order for me on AutoShip because it's easy. It gets the job done and I don't have time to go look for any other brands or to compare brands or to do all the research. So think about products like that that you use every day out of habit. Think about the platforms that you use every day out of habit. When you plop on the sofa at night to binge watch something, do you open Netflix first? Or is it Hulu? Or is it Amazon Prime? What do you reach for first? What about the platforms you use in your business? We use Kajabi, partly because of sunk cost. I have spent so many years and time and energy building out what we've built there that you would have to pay me a ton of money and transfer it over for me to even think about making a switch. Or what about the browser you use? Do you default to Chrome or do you default to Safari? What are your defaults? Think about the podcasts you listen to out of habit. And more importantly, which podcast do you associate with the activity that you're doing on the treadmill or driving? What do you listen to when you're walking the dog versus maybe when you're working? So we all know that habits are powerful. This is common knowledge. But this is why consistency matters in podcasting. Not because consistency itself will grow your podcast. That's the misinformation. But because when you're in the habit of podcasting, listeners will get in the habit of listening to your podcast, which over time builds trust, which over time leads to sales. Consistency breeds top of mindness. It's stickiness. Think of sticky products, not sticky like soap, sticky because you like it, because you need it. And after a while, you use it because that's just what you've always done. That's what consistency does for your podcast, where your show becomes the go-to and it becomes the thing your listeners naturally come back to without even thinking about it. That is psychology at work right there. But another common piece of misadvice, which, oh my gosh, I am so ready for this to not be the norm, is this idea that all you need is great content. The best content won't matter if you can't get people to hit play in the first place. Which means that despite what you might have heard, having valuable content isn't the key to getting more listeners. That's not the key to growing a podcast. Because you could have the most valuable content on earth, but if you don't know how to get listeners to click play on that content, then you have no way to grow. And so you need to know how to sell why they should listen in the first place. Yes, great content is what you deliver, but you need to be able to communicate why that listener should spend their time listening to your content in the first place and then deliver on that promise. There are a lot of strategies that you could do to grow a podcast audience. But without knowing this, without knowing how to communicate to your listener that your content is worth the listen, then any and all the effort that you spend to grow your audience is going to go to waste, because you won't have a way to, first of all, attract and then keep listeners listening to your show. Now, in the past, there wasn't a lot of podcast content to choose from. So good content was king. Good content was the thing that differentiated the okay podcasts from the wow, this is really great podcasts. It's what gave people like Amy Porterfield and John Lee Dumas, and yes, even Joe Rogan, their edge back in the day. There wasn't a lot of thought or work that had to go into marketing the podcast because of simple supply and demand. There were a lot of listeners. There were not a lot of options. So the podcasts with really good content stood out and therefore rose to the top. But this is not how things operate in the world of podcasting anymore. There are even more listeners now, but guess what? There's even more content. So now good content is just one part of the equation for differentiation. Why? Because listeners are more discerning. There are far more demands on a listener's time and attention now than ever. So they're more choosy with where they spend that time and attention. And this goes back to the messaging of your podcast and knowing how to communicate that your show is worth a listener's time over other shows that they could potentially choose to listen to on the same topic as yours. Think about it. If a listener is scrolling through their feed and they're looking for a parenting podcast, and they're looking for a gentle parenting podcast, and they're looking specifically for like help breaking cycles, generational cycles in their family, and there's two podcasts that are talking about the same niche topic, what's going to make them choose one over the other? And let's say your podcast is one of those podcasts. What's going to make them choose yours over the competition? If you don't know how to differentiate yourself enough, you lose. In this day and age, it is not the ones with the best content or the most content who stand out anymore. It's the ones with the most differentiation in the marketplace. That is the simple secret sauce for growing a top podcast in today's economy. Good news, if you're an established coach or consultant or expert, you should already have your core differentiators mostly dialed in. So now it's just a matter of applying that to the podcasting space. Because the thing is, the podcasting space is a different kind of beast. A lot of times people are successful in one marketing avenue or channel. Maybe they've built an email list. Maybe they've built a big following on social media. But then they try to transfer that to podcasting. And they're like, what am I missing? This podcast is not growing. Because podcasting, it takes more than just knowing what you know and hitting publish on a podcast. It takes knowing how to apply what you know to the podcasting space specifically so you can stand out from all the others who are teaching the same things as you. So yes, even if you have a unique methodology, it doesn't matter what you know. It matters how you communicate that to your listener in a way that gets them to go, oh, this is the podcast I need. And if you feel like this is a missing piece for you and you need help learning how to position your podcast and how to develop a messaging strategy for your show so that your show is something that your audience can't help but binge, it's going to take time and it's going to take strategies. You can't get there with shortcuts. And if you want someone looking over your shoulder to guide you through that process, go to the link in the show notes, book a call with my team, and let's find out if you're a fit for pod launch, because this is what we do best. Which brings me to the final piece of misinformation, and one that's top of mind for most people when they're starting a podcast, which is, okay, how do I make money from this thing? Even if you're someone who would sit here and tell me, well, the numbers don't matter. I'm not in this for the money. At some point in time, you will come to realize that running a podcast costs money. It costs time and it costs money. I know exactly how much it costs me to produce one episode of my podcast. And when you factor in my time, it's more money than most people are probably willing to spend on their show. Which means that if you are investing anything into creating a content channel like a podcast, time, money, your team's time, gear, software, et cetera, you need to be getting some sort of return for that. Unless you're independently wealthy, but in most cases, that is not the case. And most of us are podcasting because we're using this platform as a tool or vehicle for something greater. Impact, yes. To get your message heard, yes. To change others' lives and to help other people, yes. But at the end of the day, the podcast is not going to pay for itself until it does. That's the goal. But when you strip away all the fluff and we get down to brass tacks, how do we measure impact? Through leads and income. Unless you have another way for measuring impact that I should know about. So this is where this belief comes from, that more downloads equals more money. A bigger audience equals bigger returns. This used to be true. This might be true still in some cases. For CPM advertising, it is definitely true. Because if you're going to make $24 per 1,000 listeners of podcasts, then yeah, you better be raking in some downloads if you want to make anything that'll buy you more than a quarter tank of gas these days. But here's the kicker. More downloads isn't going to matter if the audience you already have isn't buying. That's a conversion problem. That's not an audience growth problem. A bigger audience won't fix an underlying conversion problem. It's just going to be a bigger audience who doesn't buy. Listeners are getting savvier, and the industry is getting savvier too. Downloads are not even the almighty metric anymore. They used to be. But now people are turning more to engagement metrics. We're starting to see a shift in the industry towards looking at things like listener consumption and returning listeners who come back to give us a more comprehensive picture of the true level of buy-in that you have with your audience. So when it comes to making money from your podcast, in this day and age, it's not about having a big audience. It's about having the right audience. The kind of audience who not only tunes in, but the kind of audience who takes action. The kind of people who see your podcast as a solution for the very real problems that they're experiencing in their life right now, and who see you as the guide and a resource that they can trust. Because if you want to make money from your podcast, like Catherine, whose podcast is the number one source of high-ticket clients for her business, 10K a pop and more. Or Flora, who gets new clients every month from all over the world, where before she was only getting referrals locally. Or Catherine, a different Catherine, whose podcast drives new enrollments on autopilot to her evergreen program. You don't need a massive audience. What you need is a convincing core concept. A convincing core concept is a clear and compelling idea that persuades or influences someone to action unconsciously. That's the key. This goes back to differentiation. A core concept is what makes your podcast different. It's what makes someone say, oh, this show is for me. And it's the reason people will choose your podcast over the thousands of others that they could potentially listen to. Because no listener is going to look at your podcast and go, oh my gosh, you must have spent a lot of money on this cover art. Wow, how much did you? This is beautiful. I have never seen cover art so beautiful. Let me click play. No, that's not what's going through their minds. But if you know how to get them clicking on your show automatically without even thinking about it, well, guess what? You have just done what 99% of other podcast hosts aren't doing. And that alone will set you apart from the rest. It's going to give your show a fighting chance. So the reality is you don't need to reinvent the wheel to stand out in podcasting. You just need to know what makes listeners pick your show without thinking about it. Think about it. Without this, you are just going to be one in a vast red ocean of other podcasts that touch on similar topics. So why would listeners stick around, let alone take the next step with you? It's going to be your core convincing concept, that promise that draws listeners in and keeps them coming back, because they will know that they will get something unique from you that they can't get anywhere else. Maybe it's your unique perspective on an industry topic. Maybe it's a fresh angle on a problem that your audience faces. But whatever it is, it has to be hyper relevant to your ideal listener. It's not about covering every topic that might be relevant to your listener, but it's about being relevant for your listener, positioning your podcast so that it deeply resonates with the right people who are going to be the people that are most likely to buy from you and who will be willing to pay whatever it is that you want to charge for your expertise. So that's the truth. Now you know consistency is not the key to growth, but it is key to making you the go-to expert in the minds of your listeners. Content is not king. Differentiation is. And a big audience won't make you money, but the right audience and knowing how to attract them will. Because when it comes to succeeding as a podcast host, it's not about doing more, despite what the industry would have you believe. It's about doing more of what really matters. And if you found this episode helpful, if this made you think, if you had an aha during this episode that you were like, whoa, I never thought about it that way, then tap the 5 stars on Apple or Spotify and bonus points for you when you leave a review on Apple, and let me know. Because what this does is it helps other podcasters and business owners who podcast to know that this show really is worth their time, because I know that you've got a choice when it comes to podcasts to listen to. And I am so grateful to you for spending your valuable time here with me today. And speaking of Flora, who you heard me mention a moment ago inside this episode, in the next episode, she's going to be joining us to unpack how her transition away from social media marketing to a strategically positioned podcast helped her launch a show that's currently growing 5 times faster than the average podcast and attracting new clients to her business every single month from around the world. So whether you're new to podcasting or you're an established business owner who wants to use your podcast to grow your business, lean in close for this one so that you can learn how to measure your podcast success and see where you stack against the competition and build your authority in an increasingly crowded podcast landscape. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.